There you go.
All right. So we may get some more people coming in the next few minutes, but I think we'll go ahead and start so as to respect your time, Ryan, and we appreciate you being with us today. We already made some quick introductions around so you know who's in the room. But for the formal part of the webinar, just a little background on the Religion Communicators Council. So the Religion Communicators Council, or the RCC, was founded in 1929, so we're almost 100 years old, and is an association of communications professionals who work for and with a diverse group of faith-based organizations. And when we say a diverse group of faith-based organizations, we really mean that. It's one of the things that we pride ourselves on a lot is just the scope and the breadth of the organizations that are part of the RCC. But we also work in all areas of communications, public relations, advertising development. Um, there's a lot of us with a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different faiths, but we really value that because it does provide us then opportunities to learn from each other, to explore together, to increase our religious literacy, and to increase our competencies in communications. Um, Together, we promote excellence in the communication of faith and values in the public arena, and we encourage understanding among religious and faith groups. Um, and we are very, very pleased to have with us today Mr. Ryan Dunn. Mr. Ryan Dunn is a minister of digital engagement with United Methodist Communications, where he creates podcasts, videos, and other media that explore faith in accessible and engaging ways. He is the host of the Compass podcast, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday, and the MyCom Church Communications and Marketing podcast. He helps faith leaders navigate digital outreach and connect with seekers who may never walk through traditional church doors. With over a decade of experience in church communications and a heart for storytelling, Ryan is passionate about using podcasts to spark spiritual curiosity and create meaningful connection beyond the sanctuary. Um, on a couple of personal notes, Ryan is a friend of the RCC. He has attended our conventions in the past, and we've enjoyed getting to know him there. And Ryan isn't just tied to his digital life, but he enjoys the analog side of this earthly experience as well, going hiking with his family, listening to records, and cheering the Chicago Cubs. And so, with that, we would like to turn the time over to Ryan to get us started. And after his presentation, then we'll be able to have an opportunity to pepper him with some questions.
Sure. Thank you for that hand off, Ryan. It's not often I get to say that. Thanks, Ryan. Uh, in this session on podcasting, I really want to devote time to getting a sense of connection and developing an audience for the result of uh, having our most listened to podcast episodes. So, for part of this time, we're going to follow the journey of one of the most listened to podcasts that I've been a part of. Um, but first, I really want to get into the background of why we're doing what we're doing in podcasting and who we're doing this podcast for. Before we get into all that, again, Ryan, thanks for the nice introduction. My name is Ryan Dunn. For those who are joining us in video, I've listed my contact information up there. Email. I'll evangelize for faith. I'll evangelize for Black coffee, and I'll evangelize for podcasting. I love to talk about that stuff. So, if you have a want to have a conversation around any one of those things, but especially podcasting in this instance, I invite you to give me a an email message and we can set up some time to talk or just chat over email. That's fine too. With my role at United Methodist Communications, I oversee kind of digital touch points of invitation and information for people to get to know about the United Methodist Church. And that's a lot of social media, but also I host a couple podcasts, the Compass podcast, which seeks to raise awareness of God's movement in the lives of spiritual seekers. And then the second podcast I oversee is the MyCom Church Communications and Marketing podcast. And that provides resources and connection for church leaders engaged in digital ministry. In this session, we're going to concentrate on practices that really get us into podcasting and connecting with the right people through our podcast. Podcasting is wonderful because it is so accessible. It's a way for us to move into the spaces that people are often populating on their own with a great amount of ease. So it doesn't take a whole lot from our end to get involved in podcasting. But the real trick in podcasting is that it's tough to connect with an audience. I personally think that just about every ministry or faith group should be involved in podcasting in some way, shape, or form. But at any given time, there are a couple million active podcasts, and that means that there is a lot of content clogging the highways and streets and lanes that lead to the public attention. It's a really crowded space. So I do want to look and devote some time into navigating that. And one way to do that is simply to stick at podcasting for a while. I've been working in podcasting for about 9 years, which in most professional fields is not a terribly long time, but it's actually pretty long in the podcasting space. Dan Meisner, who's the head of audience development for Pacific Content, did an analysis of about 500,000 podcasts. And he found that the median age of those podcasts is 174 days, which is just a little bit less than 6 months. And that length is important to note because longevity really does play a role in audience growth because very few podcasts start with a big audience. You need to have some celebrity status to start with a large audience. So if you're Michelle Obama, you can start your podcast with a few million listeners, but the rest of us probably start our podcast with an audience of our moms and a few of our friends, and then it grows from there. And I think the idea that people are getting into podcasting and they're going to meet 100,000 people right off the bat leads them to give up fairly quickly. So they get 6 months in, the download numbers aren't what they supposed they were going to be, and they just drop off. It takes a while for people to discover the content that we're putting out. And I'll bet if most of us took an inventory of the podcasts that we listen to on a regular basis, we'd find that most of them have been around for over 2 years. It just takes that kind of longevity to start the snowball rolling down the hill where people begin to pay attention. And also want to caveat in saying that most of us are never going to have a podcast that reaches more than a couple thousand listeners. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Because this is such a long journey in developing an audience for a podcast, it's important to articulate and then to come back again and again to why you want to do this. Now, most of us start our podcast without somebody else really asking us to do so. I mean, we might have the situation where a boss, a pastor, a leader says, well, we're going to start a podcast, and you're just kind of in that professional space where it's not a good idea to say no to that. So you say, yes, sure, we are starting a podcast. But most of us are probably more driven by a need to share something or to draw attention to something that we care about than we are to actually be responding to the requests of the public at large. So we'll get deeper into the why, but I can't really separate that why from the who of who we're trying to serve with our podcast. As religious communicators, we're pretty focused on the who in most of what we do, because in the end, we want to serve people. So in podcasting, we want to make sure that we are very specific about the who it is that we're trying to reach. We want to define our audience very specifically. And I found that the more concise that we can be in defining our audience, the more likely we are to actually reach somebody. And this isn't about exclusion, but it's going to benefit us to admit that our podcast isn't necessarily for everybody. We want to get specific and we want to stay specific. Again, if we think about the 2 million podcasts that are out there, that is a lot of choice for people to navigate through. So unless we're speaking specifically to them, they're more likely to move on to something else that kind of fits their more specific needs. And even a huge podcast, like say the Joe Rogan podcast, if you conjure up a mental image of a Joe Rogan listener, there's something that is pretty specific that comes to mind. Probably a straight white guy would help to maybe think of wearing plaid, saying bro, I don't know. You get it though. Don't sweat about growing a huge audience. Just think about how you garner the attention of the specific audience who you want to provide value to. Our podcast audiences likely start with the people around us. And it's important to note this and to consider who is listening to our episodes. Now, more than likely, as we start our podcast, we're talking to people who we know. And that demystifies some of the elements then of podcast design. So, for example, we may wonder about what is the right length of a podcast episode. Well, we can look at the research and we can see that most podcasts are somewhere about 30 to 40 minutes in length. But if our audience is built around, say, the commuters who we sit next to in the pews on a Sunday morning, then we might start to think, well, it'd be a little bit better if we had an hour-long episode that they can take with them in the car a day each week. Honestly, I build the Compass podcast with people like my friend Josh in mind. He's an exterminator. He listens to podcasts nearly all day, every day, while he's crawling underneath houses or driving from one job to the next. This leaves Josh with a lot of time. It also, I need to keep in mind that Josh is always engaged in other activities while he's listening. So if Josh is one representative of my greater audience, I'll do well to build my episode content with Josh's circumstances in mind. And that goes to the heart of our first point in crafting our most listened to episode. So we have our who, and then we're going to define our why of our podcast. In other words, we're going to start with the overall vision of the podcast. In my case, I want to help spiritual seekers, so people who are kind of faith curious or spiritually curious, but maybe not engaged in a community of faith. I want to help them become aware of God's presence, even as they're doing things like driving to the job or looking for termites underneath the house. And we might need to take on just a little shift in our mindset then concerning the why of our podcast. And for me, that starts with this nugget. Podcast listening is a solitary activity for most people. So relatively few people listen to podcasts alongside other people. Most of the podcasts I listen to, I'm listening to with headphones in, and I'm doing something else because I'm alone. So when we're speaking into our microphones as podcast producers, from the listener's perspective, we're speaking to them, this singular person, one person. We're not speaking to a whole mass of people. We're speaking to one person at a time. Our messages then, and the why behind our podcast should speak to that individual. So instead of saying, for example, from a church, we're going to have a sermon podcast so that people can hear the Sunday sermon, we'll benefit from admitting to ourselves that we're producing a sermon podcast so that, say, Tony, who works on a lot of Sunday mornings, can now share in the messages that inspire our faith community. And this is a little bit semantical, but adopting this small mind shift to be what they might call user-focused or listener-focused keeps our focus on making the listener the chief benefiter of our content and not us as podcast producers being the chief benefiter of what we're doing. And it keeps us focused off the download numbers then, because we can get lost in thinking, well, I'm not getting 20,000 downloads a month. Whereas if we're getting 200 downloads a month, but connecting with the right people, then there's real value in the podcast for everybody. And I hope this makes sense because it's really important. And if not, we can describe it a little bit more as we get to question and response afterwards. But being specific, being audience focused will definitely help us figure out the best ways to get the word out about our podcasts and connect with our audiences as well. Now, Josh found the Compass podcast because I told Josh about the Compass podcast. A lot of people discover podcasts that way, but Josh also finds a number of his other podcasts through YouTube, and he's not alone. YouTube has become one of the go-to platforms for podcast discovery. And actually, I want to take a little bit of a tangent here to admit that if I were to start today, I would actually consider starting a YouTube channel instead of a podcast right away. Starting a podcast again is very easy. YouTube is a little bit tougher, but getting anyone to listen to our podcast is really tough because in the traditional podcasting model, you build your recording system, you create your great content, you find a hosting service, you distribute on the podcast platforms, and then you market in the hopes of building an audience, right? But the glitch is that podcast apps like Spotify or Apple Podcasts don't really do anything for your small podcast. It's just there, it's libraried in their system. And then it's up to you to drive people to their app to grow your audience. Well, we can contrast that with YouTube, where you're still driving people to their app, but it's a quicker way to build an audience. It's the second largest search engine after Google. People actively search for content on the platform. So your videos can surface in recommendations or search results or related video suggestions. And podcasts rely more on, again, word of mouth or directory listings or the work that you do through external promotion. Many people just kind of browse YouTube casually, and podcasts can appear in that. And YouTube's algorithm can expose your content to new viewers who might not otherwise be seeking it. So it also has these built-in tools for engagement, which as podcasters, we're going to find really helpful, but which aren't actually available to us in a lot of the audio-only formats. So we can see comments right there on the content. There are live streams, there are polls, there are community posts, and the added metrics of being able to see things like watch time and where people have discovered your podcast is really helpful. In a lot of traditional podcasting metrics models, it's all dependent on numbers of listens and downloads. So there's just a more robust area for metrics and measurement in there. It's a better feedback loop. I want to tell you about a pastor named Brandon Robbins, just to kind of provide a case study in this. Brandon began a YouTube channel. He was kind of all over the place at first. So he was making some videos about leadership tricks or recommendations for churches. He did some doing some exegetical work for his congregation. And he was about to give up on the YouTube channel altogether when he started doing just response videos to the TV series called The Chosen. And those started to grab a lot of attention. And so he started speaking more into that a little bit. His series, this series was really expanding his subscriber base. And the moment showed to him the potential of YouTube's algorithm and the visual first discoverability to reach a new audience then. And then as the channel grew, Brandon improved the production quality of what he was doing. So in the early days, it was really a video recorded just like we're doing now. Brandon sitting in front of a camera talking. Sometimes he had a whiteboard behind him that he would write on. As he grew in scale, he was able to add in other visual elements, sometimes pasting in graphics over top or adding in clips from the television show that he was talking about. And importantly, though, he began designing his content so that it didn't rely solely on the visuals. He was making it suitable for an audio-only format as well. And so what has happened is that Brandon's been able to repurpose these YouTube videos by stripping out the audio and then distributing that on an audio-only podcast format. And this allows his audience then to engage with his teachings on a whole nother level. They can take them with them in the portability lure of a podcast that an audio-only podcast offers. But he's also been able to build upon that audience that he was able to reach through YouTube. And the way that he presents the content, it streams well into an audio-only format as well. So there's not an overt reliance on visuals or charts or long cutaways. And what Brandon is doing then is he's recording once and then publishing multiple times. And that minimizes the extra work of reusing the same core content across multiple platforms. So he gets the benefit of this discoverability and growth. And then the podcasting helps to drive a depth of engagement since the audio listeners spend more time sustained with that content. And then having all this content across all these platforms, well, it just kind of it expands his reach and the ability to connect with new people. So this represents a logical and a scalable path. So he's using YouTube's discoverability to grow an audience, then repurposing that same content into an audio podcast to deepen engagement. And then he leverages all those channels for the maximum impact with really a minimal duplication of effort. Now, I lift all this up not to say that if you're already doing an audio only podcast, like I've been for a number of years, that we need to scrap what we're doing and look to YouTube instead. But instead, this can provide an invitation for us to consider how we might live into having our podcast present in the YouTube space to build on some of that discoverability. Even if it's just an audio only podcast, there's still value in having some activity on that platform. And I think this would actually be a good time then to kind of pivot and talk about one of our most downloaded episodes on the Compass podcast, because it leads into that kind of model that we're utilizing. This is actually going back a few years, but it's still a podcast episode that gets new listens today, even though it's several years old. And again, I don't want to put a lot of emphasis on the download numbers. They're going to be relative to who we are and who we're trying to reach. I lift up this as one of our most downloaded episodes because for us, then it indicated that we were making some kind of connection with our audience. And in this case, well, they download the fact that we made the right decisions about delivering valuable content for our listener. So the podcast that we're going to follow here is Simple Life Rhythms for Balance and Peace. It was an interview with Sister Joan Chittister, who's an author from a Benedictine monastic community. Some of us in the religious world might be familiar with Sister Joan's work. She's been on Oprah, written a number of books. I don't know if a lot of our Compass audience was familiar with Sister Joan's work. However, I'm pretty sure that Josh didn't know who she was before coming on the podcast. So that goes to say that even if we have this boost of adding some name recognition to our podcast, we still need to make a promise of value, because not everybody is going to know who this person is. And in this case, I approached Sister Joan because she had just released a book at that time translating daily Benedictine practices for modern life in the midst of the pandemic. We were still kind of in the days of being somewhat shut down and kind of easing out of that when this podcast came out. So at the time, we were feeling kind of wearied and bored. It felt like there would be a lot of value to our listener to suggest some spiritual practices that might be able to awaken something in the midst of daily life. And so in this case, I made zero assumptions about utilizing Sister Joan's platform to build my podcast audience. Instead, we just wanted to make sure that we were focusing on offering some value to our listener. It just so happened that Sister Joan really, really offers value in that department. And that might help us clarify what it looks like to start with the why or the vision of our podcast. So you start with the why for what you're doing, and then you build your episode with the understanding that your audience has expectations, and this episode needs to meet those expectations. So for the next step then, started with the why, and then I needed to do the episode preparation. The first thing I did was read her book. Most publishers, I just want to mention, will make a copy of a book available for members of the media who are willing to give publicity for their authors. Even if you're starting with a tiny, tiny podcast, they'll give you a book without really questions about listenership. So it's not like you need to cross some threshold before you start asking publishers for copies of the book. For Compass, a majority of the interviews that we do are with authors, and I've never been asked for download numbers in order to get a copy of a book. So besides reading a book, I took a few more steps to familiarize myself with Sister Joan. A common practice that I have even to this day is to Google the guest's name and podcast just to see if they've made appearances on other podcasts. And a couple benefits to this are, one, I get an idea of what intrigues people about this particular person. But also for me, it gives me the opportunity to begin to build a sense of familiarity with the person who I'm interviewing. So by listening to them, I start to build a kind of a parasocial sense of rapport with that person. And for me, that's big because I want the listener to feel at ease and engaged with our content. And it's tough to do that when it feels like there's this barrier between the interviewer and the interviewee, or when we feel uncomfortable with each other. So for my part, I want to feel comfortable. And I feel like I begin to ease into that comfort a little bit by listening to them in conversation with other people. I've noticed that late night talk show hosts always give off this sense that they're old friends with their guests, that we're just kind of dropping in on one of their many, many conversations, when in fact, that's not often the case. They might talk a little bit beforehand. However, they're just good at establishing that rapport. And I try to bring that vibe into the podcasts I produce, though I don't really, have it down like Jimmy Fallon or Johnny Carson, for example. So once I've familiarized myself with the content, I try to discern a landing point for the episode. And that landing point is generally an expectation that I set for the listener. What do I hope that they've received or heard by the end of the episode? And in my example episode, I expected that the listener was going to see a way that they could apply some Benedictine inspired rhythm into their daily lives. And it's important to me to communicate this expectation to all the people involved in recording the podcast. And we might feel a little bit intimidated or afraid of stepping on a guest's toes and supposing for them that this is what our podcast is going to be about. It's tempting to just say, well, we can talk about whatever you want. But I've found that the conversation goes way, way better when I supply for us a goal in that conversation. In Sister Jones' case, I was able to suggest, well, our listeners are curious about faith, but they're not really involved in a community of faith. They're going to really benefit from hearing how you've applied these spiritual practices in your own life. And setting a landing point then frees the guests up a little bit. I found it frees them from having to communicate ideas so much, and instead it invites them to tell more stories, which makes for really the best podcast experience. So from there, I make an outline of the episode. This is really just some specific questions that I'm likely to ask. I will compile these. Oftentimes, I will send them to the guest ahead of time, always with the caveat and saying, like, these are some questions that I'm interested in. We're going to go where the conversation naturally takes us. But this gives us this platform to jump off of. And that I think goes into that sense of easiness that helps to establish rapport between the interviewer and interviewee. I know people in the journalistic area, they want to kind of be a little bit more spontaneous in their conversations. There's probably podcasts where that is very important. For a lot of us who are doing these kinds of podcasts where we're talking with people who maybe aren't always before the camera or on the microphone, it really helps to provide a sense of ease again when we supply these questions. Again, noting that we may talk about something completely different, but this gives us that platform on which to base our conversation. So once we're ready to hit record, a few things to keep in mind. Bad quality can disrupt great content. And in fact, when we recorded Sister Jones' episode, she had some bad Wi-Fi. She's fairly tech savvy, so we were able to kind of navigate through that. She just really had to move to a different spot to get better Wi-Fi. But we want to just avoid anything that takes away from or distracts from the content that we're trying to provide. And that's not to say that we need to have the perfect audio setup. We just want to make sure that there's nothing that is overly distracting, like an echo in the voice coming back, or a high-pitched whine throughout the whole interview or anything like that. So oftentimes I'll recommend that guests use headphones. I really push for some kind of external mic. So either if they have a podcasting mic, that's wonderful. If they don't, I would ask them to have some kind of earbuds with a microphone. Basically, the closest they can get their mouth to the microphone, the better. And of course, good Wi-Fi or good internet connection is also a necessity. And then once we hit record, I like to start with the quote unquote meat of the episode first. And what I mean by that is that the interview or actual content of the episode is the first thing that we record. So I don't record necessarily in a chronological sequence for the episode. And this way, the interviewee doesn't have to be subjected to any of the marketing banter or ad reads that we have to run through prior to starting a podcast episode. It also provides the host with an opportunity then to set the table a little bit more clearly when it comes to opening an episode. And what's cool is that we can make suggestions for the listener as to what to listen for. So I often record the lead in to the episode last. And that way I can make sure our listener knows that there's a reason to listen right away. And in fact, I really try to show value for the listener in the first 15 seconds of each episode. So a suggestion that, hey, in this episode, you're going to hear this, and this is why it's meaningful. So once we record, we can talk editing. The first thing I do with the recorded track is I run a compressor effect on it. That just kind of evens out the waveforms. It brings everything closer together. It evens out the peaks and valleys in volume. It can also take out some of the annoying tinniness of a poor quality microphone. Then I'll run a loudness normalizer. That sets the peak to an audio level. And that way we can avoid any situations where we have our lead in and it's recorded at, say, 8 decibels, and then our interview is at 6 decibels. And then we go back, we can even all that out with a loudness normalizer. And then the third effect I run, and I do all this before I do any editing, is the noise reduction effect. And I'll take a sample of the room noise. Oftentimes, as we start an interview, I'll let the guest know, like, hey, I'm just going to leave about 5 or 6 seconds of dead space, and then we'll jump in with conversation. And that's where I'm recording the room noise. So I can use then this noise reduction tool that is available in most audio editing and even some video editing suites now, and remove any kind of background noise. So if they have a fan running in the background, we're able to take that hum out. After running those, that's when I get to editing. And in my experience, I've kind of run the gamut in terms of editing. So I used to finely comb the entire episode. There were no awkward pauses. There were very few filler words. Nobody really took a breath during our episodes because I cut out all those long breaths. Well, I ran up against some deadlines where I just wasn't going to be able to do that level of editing. And when I released those episodes, nothing changed. Like the listener numbers stay steady. And as I did this over time, I realized that this probably was not a detraction for the listener to have a few filler words in there or some loud breaths or people gasping for air. It was all fine. So now I just edit the episode to remove anything that's going to be a distraction from the content. You know, say there's a dog barking in the background and we needed to re-record a part, like that's what we're taking out. In Sister Jones' example, I had to remove a segment because her feed was a little bit garbled because of that bad internet connection. At this point of cutting, I'm simply looking to remove, again, anything that's going to disrupt the user's ability to follow the content. And then once we've recorded, once we've processed, once we've cut it, it's time for the exciting part, which is hitting that publishing button. And sharing the work is important. I know that there can be this sense of, celebration when we hit the publish button and then we just want to leave everything behind and move on to the next thing. But no one is going to listen to our well-crafted episode unless they're invited to listen to our well-crafted episode. So when we want to invite people, episode description is key. On a scale of 1 to 10, listeners in a survey gave a 7.8 rating on average to the episode description. It's key to hit play on a new podcast. And you can see other some of the other factors that went into there. For those who are doing the audio only, about 6.5 people deferred to episode titles. 5.5 were looking for how frequently episodes came out. Just over 5 on average people were looking at the ratings. I want my episode description to promise value to a listener, and I want it to include some searchable keywords related to the episode, and also it needs to be brief. And all this going into mine, I feel like writing an episode description might be the toughest part of the whole process. This is where I will tend to lean into some of the AI features that are out there, because it can give a platform for us to build an episode description off of, especially in asking it to identify keywords that might be searchable for, say, a search engine optimization search. And that goes to say that I kind of rely on the robots to tell me how to communicate to other robots. Of course, I'm never going to take anything in cart or as is that AI presents. I always feel like I know better. Maybe that's just me, but it can help to take some of that tension away from that pressure-packed moment of developing an episode description. Sister Jones came out before the time of the proliferation of artificial intelligence. So this is one I wrote all by myself. One of the marks of monastic communities is that they establish a rhythm of life that calls attention to the holy. And then we went on to describe who Sister Joan was, and of course mentioned things like the book that she had written, some of the other interviews that she had given, and some of the value that she was going to promise to our audience. I'll sometimes include specific questions that I asked in the episode within the episode description, especially if I think it's a question that the listener is likely asking. Podcast listeners have lots of different ways that they find new content. This is a breakdown illustrating how listeners find new podcasts. About 53% find it by searching a podcast directory. We can break that number down even further, that 31% of those listeners find new podcasts on YouTube, and then about 24% find it on Spotify, and 12% find it on Apple Podcasts. And that just kind of underscores the importance of good episode descriptions. So 53% searching their podcast directory, looking at episode descriptions to decide if they're going to listen. 22% are being referred by a friend. 14.5% take a suggestion from another podcast. So podcast host says, "Oh, I've been listening to this great podcast." People are then going to turn over and listen to that podcast as well. Just about 5% find their podcast through Google. 3% heard the guest on another podcast episode and followed them to that podcast then. And just about 1.5% of people are finding their new podcasts through social media. Again, in building an audience, I think that consistency is crucial. A half-hearted posting schedule kind of leads to a half-hearted audience. And this doesn't mean that you necessarily need to commit to having a weekly episode release or even bi-weekly. Instead, I would translate this to mean that you should just be predictable in your releases. So be upfront in saying that we release a new episode on the first Monday of each month. Just don't give your listener another reason to believe that you might have dropped out, that you might have become one of those podcasts who leaves the territory after 174 days. I'm just kind of advocating for whatever you can committing to do it consistently. Then what you can do to get your episodes in front of people, especially the people who will make up your engaged audience. Well, I wish I kind of had a magic solution to this, but first we need to admit that no one really does this for free. in terms of marketing your podcast. So some of the podcast hosting services make it sound like they're promoting your podcast. I don't believe that they really are. They're posting it on Apple Podcasts, they're posting it on Spotify for you, and it's listed there with the other 2 million other podcasts on those services. If people are going to find your podcast, it takes effort on your part. And that means sharing links across social media, and it can mean creating clips and sharing from your podcast as well. To give some ideas around promotion, one of the things that I love to do is build a page for each episode of a podcast. And I'll do this for a few reasons. One, it makes the content a bit more searchable. So, especially if you're including transcripts of your episode in the text of the page, it's just a lot more searchable text for the web trawlers. Secondly, I build the page for each episode because I want to give listeners one spot that they can go to no matter what podcast platform they listen through. So it might seem easy to grab a link of our episode from Apple Podcasts, and then we share that all over social media. But if our listener is a big fan of Overcast and they just don't like Apple Podcasts, well, then we're making it a difficult journey for them. So a web page serves as this collection point where I can collect links to many of the listening platforms and then share those in one space where ultimately we have control. And then the third reason why I like to do an individual page for each episode is that it serves as a place to offer extra resources for the listener. So relevant links and that kind of thing. A web page allows me to do that. So I built this page for the Joan Chittister episode. And on that page, I included listening links, my episode description, a transcript, a video based on the episode. Most of the time, I'm presenting just kind of like a Zoom feed. So we have the talking heads speaking to one another through our digital recording channel. In the Sister Joan episode, because of the Wi-Fi issues, we weren't able to use the video, but instead I made an audio-based video, and I put some animated graphics on top of it, just to be able to, again, to live into that YouTube space. All right. After we've built the web page, shared that link wherever I could on social medias. Originally, I shared a video clip that I made from the episode. Later on, I just shared a link. And the note here is that this isn't just a one-time post and then let it be. It's good to return to these episodes, both to see how we can mine these episodes for more internet content, which is always helpful, but also to see how we provide more points of invitation for people to collect value from what we've produced. And then that really takes us back to where we started. I mean, again, it takes a while. Very few podcasts take off right away. So focus on creating good content over creating an audience. And for me, it pays a lot to remember that I'm talking to one person at a time. And my job is to invite that person to engage with the valuable content that we're producing in our podcasts. So again, here's my contact information. And if we have some questions coming through the chat, that's fantastic.
We have one on the chat, but I have a slew of them that I wrote down and
Fantastic
don't
as well,
have in
Ryan.
the chat. To start out with, can we go back to your last comment
Yeah.
that you made about how it takes time, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
I'm curious, when did you feel that you hit your stride? Both in terms of like, okay, I'm not experimenting anymore. I know my audience. I'm providing content they want. I have the audience that I like. When did you feel like you're like, okay, I got this?
Yeah, that's funny because when I started, I had every intention of having this huge podcast, right? I was looking at things like, well, I wonder how long it's going to take for us to get on Apple's top 10 or something like that. I've let go of that expectation now 9 years later. Like that's not where we're going. That's
Like,
not
I'm
who
not
we
winning
are.
any Webby
I
awards right now.
Right. I think we kind of found uh, that place when there was a sense of plateau that For us, just for full transparency, that was about 1,200 downloads a month in what we were looking at on our metrics. And that became the baseline then for me to start thinking of, well, okay, so we've done this. This is what we're getting for the effort that we've put in. Now, what do we start adding in to maybe help reach more people? And that's where we started to play around with things like adding video elements to what we were doing and growing from there.
And how long did it take you to reach that plateau?
That's a good question. We had to
The fourth
search through
episode
so
or the
no,
40th?
no. Probably about 2 years, 2 or 3 years,
Okay.
I would say. Yeah. It was a while in development. And part of that just is because we were playing it it was a little bit of the Wild West to begin with, that, we didn't have a consistent posting schedule. So in a sense, we were stopping and starting all the time. Um, we weren't clear on how best to promote. So there was a lot of just playing around to see what worked. And thankfully I had the permission to be able to kind of do that playing around to see what worked, until we got to that point of development.
It what you were saying about it's initially your friends and family
Yeah.
way back in the day. So this is probably 20 years ago almost now. It was like the very front end of podcasting and that kind of stuff. And I developed a little podcast for the embassy in Kiev in Ukraine. And we noticed that there was a lot of downloads coming from Kentucky. And we're like, why are there so many downloads coming from Kentucky? It was the ambassador's mom. But
Yeah. Know your audience. Yep.
But there's so Wesley put in the chat before he had to jump off. He said, you mentioned that the idea of your audience being individuals as opposed
Hmm.
to collectives, couples, or groups, but how does that shift the way you speak to your guests? Right? Like if you understand that your audience is a singular person, right? But how does that shift how either how you coach the guest, how you speak to the guest, how you interact with your guest?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I have to kind of be a surrogate for the listener in a lot of cases. So oftentimes it means that I'm asking a question that I might know the answer to because I've read the book or have just had previous research on this person. Um, but it's a question that I think that the listener needs to get an answer to. So uh, that definitely helps. And so when you have an archetype for a listener in mind, you're just able to kind of be that surrogate for that person. So,
Mhm.
maybe it's not Ryan asking, but if Josh were doing this, Josh would want to know this. So to ask from that perspective. Um, and yeah, I think that's probably the biggest factor for me in that. And also it keeps me away from maybe thinking that I'm gonna go after some gotcha journalism and really drive those download numbers. Like, oh man, if I pin this person on this issue, if we get some angry reactions out of this or something like that, then we're really gonna kind of tip the scales and maybe get a couple hundred more downloads on this episode. It keeps me away from that kind of vainglorious pursuit to
Right.
just ask, what does the listener need in this situation?
Well, and in which case, that's also an argument for um, providing those questions in advance, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're trying to embody the Joe Blow listener, that you're like, okay, these are the things that they're going to want to know. So you prep the guest, and the guest is able to provide that.
Yeah, and one cool trick to use, if you have a feedback mechanism that you can use where you can let listeners know that, hey, I'm going to have an interview with somebody on this topic. What questions do you have? I feel like that's a great tool. So, and actually going back to this Sister Joan Chittister episode, I was able to go into a couple different Facebook groups and say, because she had some name recognition, to say that I'm going to have a conversation with Joan Chittister. What questions would you want to ask? And I was able to then present that in the course of the interview to say, well, one of our listeners asked this. And I think whenever we're able to do that, Not only is it important for the one listener who asked that question, but a lot of listeners grab onto that by proxy, that they feel a sense of inclusion and participation and being able to do that as well.
Ryan, I had a couple questions for you that are kind of tied together. So I've heard some different stats on like the length of a podcast, that if it gets too long, you just lose folks.
Yeah.
And then also like the audio versus video. Do you have any insight into either of those?
Yeah, I think in terms of length, that's where it can really relate to who's your audience. So, and so much of it is personal preference. Like I might find a topic terribly interesting, but if the episode is an hour and a half long, there's very little chance that I'm going to engage with that long. Yeah, I don't consume podcasts in that way. So, um, if you have mechanisms where you're able to measure how long people are listening. And again, that's where YouTube is kind of helpful, where you can look at those videos. If you put up a 45-minute episode and people are consistently dropping off after 32 minutes, well, you kind of have a suggestion on where to follow there. I think that if you dig deep into Apple Podcasts, the back end of that, they might be able to supply some of that length information too. I don't think Spotify is offering it yet. I could be wrong on that, however. So that's one case. And then on the video side of things, I think that right now we're kind of in this movement in terms of how people are thinking about podcasting, where a younger generation, when they think about podcasts, they're probably already thinking about somebody's YouTube channel. And like for my generation, I think about, well, this is something that I'm going to consume on Apple Podcasts. And it's cool if it's on YouTube and it's cool if there's a video. But more so now, I think that probably there are younger content creators who are recording the video, kind of like what I talked about with Brandon Robbins. And then they're just stripping that video, the audio off of that video and presenting it in their podcast form, but they're thinking video first. And even a large platform like Spotify is starting to give a nod to that, and that you can upload videos to Spotify now of your podcast. I haven't seen, we've done this on several episodes. I haven't seen it impact on the Spotify platform any boost in listenership. However, that's could just be because it's new. What I will add is that in putting our episodes on YouTube, we're not drastically shifting the needle, but for a podcast that just gets a few hundred downloads a month, adding in like another 40 or 50 engagements is pretty big. So, for us, that looks pretty good to be able to say, well, we're getting an additional 60 views
Yes.
for our podcast episodes. I mean, that's kind of nice. Yeah, it works.
And then a kind of a follow-up question is, how long is the life of a podcast? So you mentioned that Sister Joan has, kind of a resurgence. Like,
Yeah.
do you just archive them and leave them out there forever, or how long does that?
Yeah. Ours are out there forever.
Okay.
I've had a couple podcast series that have discontinued that are still available in the ether space of the internet, that are still getting downloads. So, yeah, it's kind of like having a web page. I would say that the life of any given podcast episode is good as long as it's still relevant. So, and there's no harm, in my opinion, there's no harm in leaving an older podcast episode out there. So, 2020, everything we did was talking about the pandemic, right? And that's not very evergreen. However, there's still probably some value in having it out there.
Well, and I guess to your point, as long as one person's downloading it, it's
Right.
relevant to them somehow. So interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then so if you want to update, like probably something that would be good for me to do is to go back through our episodes over the years and see what maybe needs an update. So what was a popular episode that maybe just has some references now that are super dated and we want to revisit it.
That's
And
a good
just
point.
revisit the speaker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, you did your interview with the sister in 2021.
Yeah.
Now, 4 years later, might be worth revisiting, just talking to her again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Going back to what you were saying about, posting on video and whatever, and the cross posting, right? Um, do you find so in an audio only format, you can edit out a lot of things without it being distracting, but in a video, you can't.
Yeah.
So that editing features or that editing process, do you find that you are less prone to edit things because of the fact that it's on video? And does that then affect your audio quality so that it can be a little bit cringe sometimes? Um, and then, so that's my one question. And then my other question is TikTok, because you're talking about posting your videos on YouTube, right? But then there's also the short form content of TikTok or YouTube Reels or whatever, or not YouTube. Is it what? Instagram
Yeah.
Reels,
Instagram.
or whatever. Do you also use those additional platforms, take just a clip, a 5-second clip, or a 1 minute clip in order to bring people to the podcast?
Yeah, let me answer that question first. So, yes, we are using um, those, we are taking clips from our podcast and we are producing them as reels or as YouTube shorts. Here's what I've noticed. And this is, I sit in this place where, I oversee the social media side of things. And so I can kind of see the numbers on that end and then look at the podcast numbers on the other end. And because I'm the person who's posting these videos on social media, I know when they come out. Um, what I've noticed is that us putting our podcast on the social channels in that form where it's a video does not impact download numbers for the audio podcast. There are a number of reasons for that. I think the biggest one is that in the video format, there's no clickable link. So it's a disrupted user journey to go from viewing a reel and then you have to research out, well, where do I go to actually listen to that podcast? You have to go to the link in bio or whatever. And, most users aren't going to take that many steps. It does provide for us good um, social media content. And those, even if it's just two talking heads of people talking on a short form reel, we still get good engagement on there. So from an awareness standpoint, there's value in that. It does not translate back over to us seeing an increase, a noticeable click through increase on download episodes. So it's not like putting it up is going to immediately draw us another 100 listens on a podcast. Instead, it's more of I guess, a slow awareness builder in that regard. And so that's what we can use it for. I think, there's still value in sharing across social media. And then your first question there, Ryan, if we have time to go back to that one.
It was the editing one.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
if that makes a difference in how you edit it or whatever, but it makes it sound like that it's okay.
Yeah, for the most part, it's okay. My workflow now is that I edit the video before I edit the audio. So I will edit the video, make it as clean as it can be, and then pull the audio from the video. And I might do further processing on it after that. But yeah, the video comes first now.
So I don't know if we have any other questions from Jenny. I have two more questions for you though.
Cool, let's do it.
The first one is the number one pitfall that people make when they're starting a podcast. What's the number one thing that keeps them from getting even to that 174 days?
They have a great idea for 1 or 4 episodes, and then it kind of peters out after that. So, you know, my recommendation would be,
So
well,
they
hey,
sprint too quickly when it's a marathon.
yes, exactly. Yep, that's it. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So that goes back to that really being directional and intentional about the why of what you're doing and then how
Yeah.
you can keep building on that. So,
And that's actually my last question that I have is the why of what you're doing. Okay.
mhm,
Because we've talked a lot about measuring metrics and downloads and views and that kind of stuff. But the why, especially of your Spiritual Seekers podcast, is because you're trying to help people spiritually seek, so to
mhm,
say.
yeah.
How do you measure whether they've found what they're looking for?
Whew. I don't think there are numbers
How,
that
how,
can help you.
well, but it's like if that's why you're doing it, how do you know that you're doing it?
Yeah, some of the things that I would look at to indicate on that is comparing episodes and which episodes maybe are gaining more downloads than others. And then to try to remove some of the other factors. So you can have somebody really well known and that's going to deliver you a little bump in listenership. So, maybe you need to kind of equalize for that a little bit. But to really then look across the various topics that you're addressing, and I suppose if we got really advanced about this, we could probably look at keywords and tags for episodes and compare then, listenership by keyword. Um, that's a cool idea. And I may need to look at doing that at some point. But you know, to say like, okay, so what here is delivering value? What are people connecting with and that they want to listen to? So that's one. Um, that I would look at to see. And also, I think just to kind of measure if there's a consistent growth. Like it doesn't have to be huge, but if slowly month over month you're just seeing a few more listens per month, that helps to indicate that at least people are finding value in what you're doing. I suppose if you have a really robust feedback mechanism like uh, a Discord server or a really active Facebook group, then you can start to get some of those personal stories where people are able to articulate like, oh yes, this helped me do blank. And sometimes you can get that just on a comment on a generally broadcasted or shared social media post. But yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I had one, and just for so how do you protect like the name and the brand? I would assume that Compass, lots of folks might want that for their podcast name. How do you protect that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, because the name is all over. I think um, again, to look back a number of years ago, we would have been probably a lot more definitive in naming our podcast, something relevant and clearly stating what the value is or what the purpose of the podcast is. So we found that now we have to really put out like the full semicolon title, like Compass Finding Spirituality in the Everyday, for people to be able to go directly to what it is that we're producing. Um, so that being said, like we can't own any copyright on Compass. Um, we don't have a specific domain name. Like our domain is umc.org/compass. We're just using the United Methodist Church's website for that. Um, and yeah, so I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but I think probably in the initial phases is to be very direct, try to be as descriptive as possible in titling your podcast, even sacrificing some of the cuteness that may come with like a cool punny title or something like that, just to make sure that it's clear to both the in-person user and the robot user to what you're talking about for search features, and then to claim the domain. Even if you're going to feed off to another website. So if you have an institutional website, denominational website, a church or ministry website where your podcast is going to be hosted, maybe even still grab a domain name that acts as a friendly URL that redirects to that other page. Just helps assert some ownership there too.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ryan, for
Yes.
your time, for your insights. This was absolutely fascinating content, and we'll make sure that we get it out on all of our channels. Uh,
Yeah.
but we appreciate your taking the time to be with us today and sharing of your expertise and knowledge.
Yeah, you bet. It's a pleasure.
Have a fantastic afternoon, and we'll see everybody again in a few weeks.
Bye.